Hello, my dear friends, and welcome back to our channel Mysterious Untold Books. Introduction. Why do intelligent people make irrational decisions? How can the same person be both remarkably insightful and predictably biased? These questions point to a fascinating paradox at the heart of human cognition. Our minds operate through two distinct systems, one fast, intuitive, and emotional, the other slow, deliberate, and logical. This dual process model reveals that our thinking isn't uniformly rational or irrational, but rather a complex interplay between automatic processes and conscious reasoning. The theoretical framework presented here transforms our understanding of judgment and decision-making by identifying systematic patterns in how we think. Rather than viewing errors as random failures, this approach reveals predictable biases arising from our cognitive architecture. By exploring concepts like heuristics, framing effects, and the divergence between our experiencing and remembering selves, we gain insight into why we consistently misjudge probabilities, why equivalent options yield different choices when framed differently, and why we often choose experiences that maximize memories rather than moment-to-moment happiness. This structured understanding of human cognition has profound implications for economics, public policy, medicine, and our personal lives. Chapter 1. System 1 and System 2. The two modes of thinking. The human mind operates through two distinct cognitive systems that work in tandem to shape our judgments and decisions. System 1 functions automatically and quickly, with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. It generates impressions, feelings, and intuitions without conscious awareness. When you instinctively duck upon seeing a flying object or immediately recognize anger in someone's voice, System 1 is at work. This system draws on our associative memory to establish connections between ideas, events, and experiences, often leading to coherent narratives that may not necessarily reflect reality. In contrast, System 2 allocates attention to effortful mental activities that demand concentration. It engages in complex computations, follows rules, makes deliberate choices, and exercises self-control. When you multiply 17 by 24, search for a specific person in a crowd, or fill out a tax form, you are engaging System 2. This system is associated with the subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration. While we typically identify ourselves with System 2, the conscious, reasoning self that has beliefs, makes choices, and decides what to think about and what to do, much of our thinking is guided by the automatic System 1. The relationship between these systems is not simply a matter of division of labor. System 1 continuously generates suggestions for System 2, impressions, intuitions, intentions, and feelings. If endorsed by System 2, these impressions and intuitions turn into beliefs, and impulses turn into voluntary actions. When everything flows smoothly, System 2 adopts the suggestions of System 1 with little or no modification. Generally, you believe your impressions and act on your desires. However, when System 1 encounters difficulty, it calls upon System 2 to deliver more detailed and specific processing to solve the problem at hand. This dual process model explains why we can be both remarkably intelligent and predictably irrational. System 1 is adept at finding patterns, making quick assessments, and guiding routine behaviors, but it's also prone to systematic errors and biases. It tends to jump to conclusions based on limited evidence, favor familiar information, and construct coherent stories even when the evidence is incomplete or contradictory. System 2, while capable of more nuanced reasoning, is lazy and often fails to intervene when it should. It readily accepts the plausible stories that System 1 constructs rather than invest in the mental effort required for critical examination. Understanding this dual system framework provides insight into why we sometimes act against our better judgment or make decisions that don't align with our stated beliefs. For instance, when we succumb to temptation despite knowing better, it's often because System 1's immediate emotional responses override System 2's rational considerations. Similarly, When we form stereotypes or make snap judgments about people, it's because System 1 automatically categorizes individuals based on superficial traits, and System 2 fails to correct these hasty assessments. The interplay between these two systems also explains why certain cognitive tasks feel effortless, while others require considerable mental exertion. Activities that initially demand full attention from System 2 can, with practice and expertise, become automatic operations handled by System 1. This is why experienced drivers can navigate familiar routes while engaged in conversation, but novice drivers must devote their full attention to the road. Chapter 2: Heuristics and Biases, Mental Shortcuts and Their Pitfalls. When faced with complex questions, our minds often substitute easier ones, a process called attribute substitution. Rather than tackling the difficult question directly, System 1 automatically replaces it with a related but simpler question, or heuristic, which serves as a mental shortcut. These heuristics are indispensable tools that help us navigate an overwhelmingly complex world with limited cognitive resources. However, they also lead to systematic biases that can distort our judgment in predictable ways. The availability heuristic illustrates this process clearly. When assessing the frequency or probability of an event, we tend to base our judgment on how easily examples come to mind. If instances of a category are readily available in memory, we assume the category must be large or common. This explains why people often overestimate the likelihood of dramatic, vivid events like plane crashes or shark attacks, while underestimating more common but less memorable risks like diabetes or car accidents. The availability heuristic serves us well in many contexts. Events that come easily to mind are often indeed more frequent, but it can lead to serious misjudgments when our memories are influenced by factors unrelated to actual frequency, such as media coverage or personal experience. The representativeness heuristic operates when we judge the probability that an object belongs to a category based on how similar it appears to our prototype of that category. When given a description of a person that matches our stereotype of a librarian, for instance, we tend to overestimate the likelihood that a person is indeed a librarian, often ignoring relevant statistical information like the relative rarity of librarians in the population. This heuristic explains why we so readily jump to conclusions based on limited information that seems to fit a familiar pattern, and why we are prone to seeing meaningful patterns in random data. The anchoring effect demonstrates another powerful bias in our thinking. When making estimates or judgments, we tend to rely heavily on the first piece of information encountered, the anchor, even when this information is arbitrary or irrelevant. In one experiment, people who were first asked whether Gandhi died before or after age 140, an absurd anchor, subsequently gave higher estimates of his actual age at death than those first asked whether he died before or after age 35. The initial value serves as a reference point from which insufficient adjustments are made, even when we are aware the anchor is meaningless. These heuristics and biases operate largely outside our conscious awareness. Even when we are motivated to make accurate judgments and are aware of potential biases, we often remain susceptible to them. Experts in various fields, including medicine, finance, and law, regularly demonstrate these same cognitive tendencies. Understanding these patterns doesn't necessarily make us immune to them, but it does help explain why intelligent people can make systematic errors in judgment and provides a foundation for developing strategies to improve decision-making in important domains. Chapter 3: Prospect Theory and Loss Aversion. Prospect theory represents a revolutionary framework for understanding how people evaluate risk and make decisions under uncertainty. Unlike traditional economic models that assume people rationally maximize expected utility, prospect theory recognizes that our decisions are shaped by psychological factors that lead to predictable deviations from rational choice. At its core, the theory proposes that people evaluate outcomes not in absolute terms, but as gains or losses related to a reference point, typically our current state or what we expect to happen. The value function, a central component of prospect theory, has three essential characteristics that capture fundamental aspects of human psychology. First, it is defined by changes in wealth or welfare rather than final states. We care more about winning or losing $100 than about the resulting total amount we possess. Second, it exhibits diminishing sensitivity. The subjective difference between $100 and $200 feels larger than the difference between $1,100 and $1,200, even though the objective difference is identical. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the function is steeper for losses than for gains, reflecting loss aversion, the tendency to feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains. Loss aversion is remarkably pervasive in human decision-making. The pain of losing $100 is typically about twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining $100, which explains why most people reject even-odds bets unless the potential gain is at least twice the potential loss. This asymmetry between gains and losses influences countless everyday decisions, from financial investment to consumer purchases. It explains why investors hold on to losing stocks too long, hoping to avoid the pain of realizing a loss, while selling winning stocks too quickly to lock in gains, even when this behavior reduces their overall returns. The endowment effect, a direct manifestation of loss aversion, reveals how merely possessing something increases its subjective value. In classic experiments, people randomly given coffee mugs demanded significantly more money to sell their mugs than others were willing to pay to acquire identical mugs. Once we own something, giving it up feels like a loss, and the pain of that potential loss makes us value the item more highly. This explains why homeowners often set unrealistically high asking prices based on what they paid rather than current market conditions. Prospect theory also explains seemingly contradictory risk attitudes, why the same person might both purchase insurance, showing risk aversion, and buy lottery tickets, showing risk-seeking. When facing potential gains, people tend to be risk-averse, preferring a sure gain over a larger but uncertain one. Conversely, when facing losses, people become risk-seeking, preferring to gamble on avoiding a loss rather than accepting a smaller but certain loss. This pattern explains behaviors ranging from desperate doubling down in gambling to escalation of commitment in failed business ventures, where decision-makers take increasingly risky actions to avoid admitting failure. Chapter 4. Framing Effects and Choice Architecture. Framing effects reveal a fundamental inconsistency in human decision-making. Equivalent descriptions of the same problem often elicit dramatically different choices. According to standard economic theory, preferences should remain stable regardless of how options are described. Yet research consistently demonstrates that the way choices are presented or framed profoundly influences what we decide. This phenomenon challenges the assumption of invariance that underlies rational choice theory and highlights the constructed nature of our preferences. The classic demonstration of framing involves a public health scenario where participants must choose between programs to combat a disease expected to kill 600 people. When the options are framed in terms of lives saved, Program A will save 200 people, whereas Program B has a 1/3 probability of saving all 600 people. Most people choose a certain option A. However, when the identical options are framed in terms of lives lost, Program C will result in 400 deaths, whereas Program D has a 2/3 probability that all 600 people will die. Preferences reverse, and most people choose the risky option D. The mere substitution of save with die triggers an entirely different psychological response, despite the mathematical equivalence of the options. Framing effects operate through several psychological mechanisms. Loss aversion makes losses loom larger than equivalent gains. So whether an outcome is perceived as a gain or loss relative to a reference point significantly affects its subjective value. Additionally, our automatic system 1 responds differently to descriptions that evoke different emotions or images, even when they represent identical situations. When physicians read statistics about a treatment described in terms of survival rates, they were significantly more likely to recommend it than when the same statistics were presented as mortality rates. Choice architecture, the thoughtful design of environments in which people make decisions, leverages these framing effects to influence behavior without restricting freedom of choice. Default options represent perhaps the most powerful tool in the choice architect's arsenal. When employers automatically enroll employees in retirement plans, requiring them to opt out rather than opt in, participation rates increase dramatically. Similarly, countries with presumed consent for organ donation achieve much higher donation rates than those requiring explicit consent, even though both systems allow free choice. The implications of framing extend far beyond laboratory experiments. Marketing professionals carefully craft messages to trigger favorable frames, describing hamburger as 75% lean rather than 25% fat, or positioning a prize as a cash discount rather than a credit card surcharge. Healthcare communication can emphasize either the risk of getting a disease or the opportunity to avoid it, with measurable differences in patient behavior. Financial advisors frame investment options as insurance against loss or opportunities for gain, knowing that each frame will appeal to different psychological tendencies. Chapter 5. The Experiencing Self versus the Remembering Self. Human well-being has two distinct dimensions that often diverge in surprising ways. The quality of our experiences as we live through them, experience utility, and how we evaluate those experiences in retrospect, remembered utility. This distinction reveals a fundamental tension between the experiencing self, which lives in the moment, and the remembering self, which keeps score and makes decisions about the future. These two selves frequently disagree about what constitutes happiness or suffering, leading to choices that may not optimize our actual experiences. The experiencing self registers the quality of each moment as it unfolds, the pleasure of a warm bath, the discomfort of a medical procedure, the enjoyment of a vacation. If we could measure this stream of experiences continuously, we would find that the total experience utility of an episode equals the sum or integral of the momentary utilities over time. Duration matters. All else being equal, longer pleasures and shorter pain should be preferred. Yet research consistently shows that our retrospective evaluations largely ignore duration, a phenomenon called duration neglect. Instead, the remembering self follows the peak-end rule, judging experiences primarily by their most intense moment, the peak, and by how they concluded, the end. In a groundbreaking study, patients undergoing a painful colonoscopy reported less overall discomfort when the procedure ended with period of diminished pain, even though this meant extending the total duration of the procedure. The patient's memories were dominated by how the experience ended, not by its total area under the curve of discomfort. Similarly, vacationers may judge a trip by its most memorable moments and final days, largely disregarding the length of the holiday. This discrepancy creates a paradoxical situation where people willingly choose experiences that contain more total suffering. In one experiment, participants who immersed their hand in painfully cold water preferred a longer trial that ended with slightly less intense pain over a shorter trial with the same peak intensity. When asked which experience they would repeat, they chose the objectively worse option, more total pain, because it left a better memory. The remembering self effectively tyrannizes the experiencing self, sacrificing moments of actual experience for the sake of the story it will tell later. The distinction between experienced and remembered utility has profound implications for how we make decisions. We choose vacations, medical treatments, and even careers based on anticipated memories rather than anticipated experiences. We may endure years of stressful work for the sake of retirement memories, or choose a painful medical procedure with a better narrative arc over one that causes less total suffering. This helps explain why people persist in activities that provide little moment-to-moment pleasure but create satisfying memories or stories to tell. This framework challenges traditional economic approaches to well-being, which typically assume a single utility function. It suggests that policies aimed at improving quality of life should consider both dimensions of well-being. For medical procedures, this might mean adding a period of diminished discomfort at the end to improve memory. For vacations, it might mean investing in memorable peak experiences and pleasant endings rather than simply extending duration. Ultimately, understanding the distinction between our experiencing and remembering selves can help us make choices that better serve both aspects of our well-being. Chapter 6: Overconfidence and the Illusion of Understanding. Overconfidence represents one of the most pervasive cognitive biases, affecting experts and novices alike across virtually all domains of human endeavor. This systematic error manifests as an unwarranted belief in our judgments, predictions, and abilities, a belief that persists even in the face of contradictory evidence. It stems from the interplay between our two cognitive systems. System 1 automatically generates coherent interpretations of available evidence without accounting for what's missing, while System 2 fails to recognize these limitations and instead endorses our intuitive confidence. The planning fallacy, a specific manifestation of overconfidence, leads us to consistently underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future actions while overestimating the benefits. This explains why major infrastructure projects routinely exceed their budgets and timelines, not by small margins, but often by factors of 2 or more. The Sydney Opera House, initially estimated to cost $7 million and take 4 years to complete, ultimately required 14 years and $102 million. This pattern repeats across domains from home renovations to software development, from wedding planning to academic projects. This systematic optimism persists because of several interlocking mechanisms. First, we tend to adopt an inside view, focus on the specifics of our current situation rather than considering the outcomes of similar past cases. When planning a kitchen renovation, we envision a best-case scenario where everything proceeds smoothly, rather than consulting statistics on how long such projects typically take. Second, we suffer from the illusion of control, overestimating our ability to influence outcomes that substantially depend on factors beyond our control. Third, competition neglect leads us to overlook how others' actions might affect our plans. Entrepreneurs focus on their own business model without adequately considering how competitors will respond. Organizational dynamics often amplify rather than mitigate these tendencies. Proposals with realistic timelines and cost estimates are less likely to win approval than optimistic ones. Those who raise concerns about potential problems may be viewed as lacking team spirit or commitment. And once projects begin, psychological pressures to justify past decisions lead to continued investment in failing initiatives, the sunk cost fallacy, rather than abandonment when new information suggests they are unlikely to succeed. The consequences of overconfidence extend beyond wasted resources. In business, it contributes to excessive market entry and high failure rates for new ventures. In finance, it leads investors to trade you frequently and hold undiversified portfolios. In international relations, it has precipitated numerous conflicts where leaders on both sides were confident of victory. Even in medicine, physicians' overconfidence in their diagnoses contributes to treatment errors and resistance to seeking second opinions. Fortunately, research suggests practical strategies to counter these biases. The premortem technique, imagining that a project has failed and then working backward to determine potential causes, helps identify risks before they materialize. Reference class forecasting, which bases predictions on outcomes of similar past cases rather than speculative scenarios about the current situation, significantly improves accuracy. And explicit recognition of uncertainty, perhaps by requiring confidence intervals rather than point estimates, can reduce the false precision that often accompanies overconfident predictions. Thank you for listening. Audiobook by Mysterious Untold Books.